Pie crusts are about as simple a bake as you can make. A good basic crust only includes flour, fat, and water. I know it's easy to buy pie crust from the store, but why not make a couple of homemade versions when you can and freeze them for later use? I'm talking about the holiday time when pie is in abundance. Make the crusts now to last all season long. Pies are America's favorite dessert. You know the saying, there's nothing more American than apple pie. And technically that's not true, since versions of apple pies are baked in the 14th century England. Americans, like the English, love both their sweet and savory pies. I grew up on good old American Southern homemade pie crusts. I used to spend most holidays and family gatherings of 30 or more with the amount of pie for one per person, and I don't mean a slice. Even on those rare occasions when there were just 4 of us, me, mom, dad, and my sister, my mom would make and still makes 4 to 5 pies every Thanksgiving and Christmas. You know, I don't think I had a store-bought pie crust until I was in college. Maybe I just didn't know. But to this day, I only make homemade pie crusts, and I have made a lot of many different indulgent versions over the years. Today though, I'm sharing with you 3 generations of 3 basic and simple pie crusts that you can make tonight and freeze in preparation for your holiday gatherings. My savory version is my grandmother's recipe on my dad's side. My sweet version is my mom's version, and my gluten-free vegan version is mine. All 3 recipes use simple, minimal ingredients that provide flavor, allowing your choice of fillings to shine. The secret ingredient in all of these is technique. So let's get to it. My grandma's 3-ingredient simple pie crust recipe includes all-purpose flour, salt, and shortening with a little water. For all of these recipes, see the link below the video. I will also include many optional substitutions for more indulgent crusts, along with my savory quiche recipe. Stay tuned for my next video on all the tips and tricks for making foolproof pie crusts. Let's start with my grandma's 3-ingredient simple pie crust. This is the standard pie crust in my family. My grandma taught my mom, and well, somewhere along the way I taught myself. Oh well, Mom didn't like me and my sister messing up the kitchen when I was a kid, so Grandma didn't mind though. Our first step is to get our fat and water cold. So we need to go ahead, you're gonna place the shortening in the refrigerator, and then in a glass or a measuring cup, you wanna add a few pieces of ice and at least a half a cup of water and set it aside. My grandma once, many times said, the colder the liquid, the flakier the crust. So you want to have ice, cold liquid, whatever it is. You can use a food processor to make the pie crust. Just be careful not to overmix the dough. My family has always made pie crust by hand, so that's the way I'm making it today, and that's the way I'll always make it as well. So in a large bowl or in your food processor, you're going to add 1.5 cups of flour. Now, when you are scooping your flour, just remember to scoop it out of the container first and fluff it up, and then add it to your measuring cup. And to that, we're gonna add 3/4 teaspoon of salt and a 1/2 cup of shortening. And shortening is so easy to cut up. I actually had my shortening in the refrigerator overnight because I wanted it to be good and cold when I put it in my recipe. Cut in the shortening until we have small pieces. I prefer to use a pastry cutter because I do not want to touch this dough. I want to touch it as little as possible because the heat from your hands will warm up the fat. Then it won't be as flaky in the oven when it bakes. We're just going to cut the shortening in until our mixture resembles small peas or coarse cornmeal, as my Southern grandma would describe it. It's very coarse. Now we're gonna add 4 to 5 tablespoons of ice cold water. So depending on the type of ice that you have, I have large chunks, so I probably don't have to do this, but I would strain my water because if you have little ice chunks, they're gonna get into your pie crust, and guess what? It's gonna create these crazy holes in your pie crust that you don't want. So I like to strain my water first. You just wanna add 1 tablespoon at a time, take a fork, and then just sort of press the mixture against the edge of the bowl so you can get the water soaking into that flour and shortening. And then you just keep adding water as you go. Okay, we have enough water in here, and I did use 4 or 5 tablespoons. I sort of lost count, but I know it wasn't more than 5. Okay, now notice there's a little bit of crumble there, but not much, but everything is moistened. I don't want to touch this very much, but I do need to gather it up. Put it in a ball. All right, and then you're just gonna place it in a piece of plastic wrap and just sort of fold it over, the plastic over. And you're going to, while it's in the plastic wrap, just make a little bit of a disc. It'll just make it easy for you to roll out. And this does make only 1 pie crust. Once you have the disc in the plastic, it's gonna go in the refrigerator for 20 minutes so it can firm up and make it easy, a little bit easier to roll out, but also keep that fat cold. That's one of the keys to making a good pie crust. So our dough is ready to roll. So you wanna add some parchment paper to a work surface. And the reason for this is so that it's easy to move our dough around and it won't stick. I've actually rolled my dough between 2 pieces of plastic and didn't have to use any flour at all. And you can also use parchment paper, put parchment paper on top, and then roll it out that way. It's just whatever you have time for and what you're comfortable doing. So you always start in the center, and then you want to press hard and roll away from you. Roll your dough out to 12 to 14 inches if you're using a 9-inch pie plate. Our dough is ready to go on our pie plate. To prevent your dough from stretching, when you go to lift it to put in your pie plate, parchment paper is good. Fold it in half. You could probably also flip the parchment paper over onto your pie plate. And then you can fold it in half again and just lift it up. Place that corner in the center of your pie plate and then just unfold it. If you can do it without tearing anything. Go through and make sure that your pie crust is at the very bottom at all the edges. That looks good. It's completely covering the pie plate. For the edges, you could just tuck them in under the dough so that we can have a thick top and create that pretty decorative edge. Cut off anything that's more than you need for creating that edge. I'm using a 9.5-inch pan. 8 to 10 inch would work well for this crust. And then you can decorate it how you want. I don't like to get my nails in the crust. I like to use my 2 knuckles and then just use my thumb, and I just go around and pinch it like so. All right, pie crust done and ready to go. At this point, we're gonna place the pie dough back in the refrigerator for another 15 to 20 minutes. Regardless of how you use this crust, refrigerate it to make sure that fat is good and cold. Remove the pie dough and add any fillings. Bake following your recipe's directions. You can either blind bake this pie crust and seal it with heat for a few minutes before you add your filling to cook in the oven, or you can cook the pie crust completely for cold desserts. So if you want to either blind bake or cook it completely, place a sheet of parchment paper on the inside. Careful not to mess up your decorative edges there. Take some dried beans or rice and just fill up your pie crust bottom to keep the pie crust from bubbling up as it bakes. You're gonna bake the pie crust at 425 degrees for 10 to 15 minutes, only just until the dough is no longer raw, but it's still pale. If I were blind baking this crust, then I would take it out about 15 minutes of baking. I had this in for about 17 or 18 minutes because I'm doing a full bake. So at that point, whether it's the 10 to 15 minute mark or the 17 to 20, you're going to remove the parchment paper and the beans, just like that, super simple. And notice that the crust is still pale. It's dry, but it's still pale. So we're gonna put it back in the oven for another 10 to 15 minutes until it's nice and golden brown. If I were blind baking this, and I would go ahead and fill it with my quiche filling or my pumpkin pie, whatever you're gonna bake in the oven, and then put in the oven for the recommended baking time for your recipe. So this pie crust just came out of the oven and I cooked it completely. A little bit of puffy spots where the fat was, but that should make it really flaky now. If we're gonna let it cool, let's cut into our savory 3-ingredient pie crust. Oh, I can hear that crunch. Okay, let's get our spoon in there. You know, it's thin. We want a thin pie crust, but you can see the different flaking off. That's a good pie crust. So if you want a really simple pie crust and 3 ingredients, this is the one to make. My mom's 4-ingredient basic sweet pie crust recipe includes all-purpose flour, salt, powdered sugar, butter, and a little water. When my mom makes sweet pies, she usually uses my grandma's simple pie crust recipe, but once in a while she'll make a sweet crust version. Unlike most pie crusts, she uses powdered sugar as the sweetener. The powdered sugar, I find, renders a tender but still flaky crust with a nice caramelized coloring. To start, you know what your grandma always said, the colder the liquid, the flakier the crust. The same applies in this recipe. So keep the butter in the fridge. I went ahead and diced mine up so the heat of my hands doesn't warm it up when I'm trying to mix it in with the mixture. Add ice and a half a cup of water to a glass so it's good and cold, and just set it aside. To a large bowl or your food processor, you're going to add 1.5 cups of flour. Just make sure you don't put too much flour in by packing it into your cup. And then we're going to add 1/4 cup of powdered sugar. And then if you're using unsalted butter, add 1/3 teaspoon of salt. I'm actually using salted butter in this recipe because that's what I have, and that's what I always have on hand. So I'm not going to add any salt. So then just mix it up once you add the salt, if you're adding it. We're going to get that powdered sugar and the flour and the salt all mixed in well. We're going to add 1/2 cup of butter, which is 4 ounces or 1 stick. And I'm just going to put that in there. Cut the butter in until it resembles small peas, or as Grandma always said, coarse cornmeal. You can see blobs of fat in there, which is great because when they melt, they'll create steam and create flakes in the pie crust. We're going to add ice cold water. And as I mentioned before, we are going to strain it just to make sure we don't get any chunks of ice in our pie crust, which will cause our pie crust to have weird holes in it. 1 tablespoon at a time. Moisten as many of those bits that you can with that tablespoon. You may have to add an extra tablespoon with this recipe because the flour and fat is the same ratio as the simple recipe, but we have sugar added, and that powdered sugar has cornstarch in it, so it's going to make it a little drier, so you might need 1 more tablespoon. If it comes together, then you know you have the right amount of liquid in it. This dough is good. I don't want to add any more moisture to it. We're going to place it on some plastic wrap, cover it up, flatten it out into a disc. If you can see the fat blobs in your dough, you're on the right path to creating a good, successful pie crust. In the fridge it goes for 20 minutes to ensure that butter is nice and cold when we go to roll it out. The 20 minutes are up, so we're gonna lightly flour parchment paper. Again, I like to use parchment paper because it's easy to fold the dough over when we place it in our pie plate, and it's easy to move the dough around so we don't have to pick it up and touch too much. I'm using a 9.5 inch pie plate, so I wanna roll my dough out to about 12 to 14 inches to make sure that we get that overhang for a decorative crust. Move that parchment paper around so that you can roll the dough away from you. Here's a tip. If you notice as you're rolling your dough that it starts to retract a bit, that means that the gluten is developing as you're rolling, and so you need to stop that. Take the dough as it is, wherever you are in your rolling process, and then place it in the refrigerator for about 15 to 20 minutes to allow that dough time to relax a bit and for that gluten to stop developing, because it will stop developing, or at least it'll slow down tremendously when it's in the refrigerator and cold. All right, so to prevent from stretching out the dough anymore, you want to fold your pie crust in half. This helps keep it from tearing. And then fold in half again. Super easy. Take your pie crust and then unfold it in your plate, like so. We want to shape it to the internal shape of our pie plate. So you can just take a knife, cut off where you want, where that extra bit is, and then just mold it into the area that maybe doesn't have quite as much. Okay, once you've trimmed it up a bit, go ahead and just fold it under. Now it's time for the decorative edge. First a second finger and then my thumb, and then just pressing my thumb in between those 2 fingers. So there you go. That's our decorative edge crust. So in the fridge for 15 to 20 minutes. Since I'm not baking my sweet pie filling, I want to completely bake this. So I'm going to place a sheet of parchment paper in here, all on the edges too. That way we don't have any bubbling up, at least not much. Gonna add some beans. You could use ceramic pie weights. You could actually even use a pie plate that's about the same size and just put it on top of parchment paper or grease it. And then I'm gonna put this in the oven at 425 for about 20 minutes. Just came out of the oven after 20 minutes. So it's time to remove my beans and parchment paper. I'm gonna put it back in the oven until it bakes completely. Oh, it's really bubbling up. If you find while you're baking your crust, if it starts to bubble up, just take a fork and just poke them back down. Since I'm baking completely, it's going back in the oven for another 10 to 15 minutes. So this one just came out of the oven. My edges started to brown more than the center, so I went ahead and put this little pie cover over it. You can just use foil, but I happen to have this. Notice how puffy it is. That should be a really flaky pie crust. So now we're gonna let this one cool before we look at the flakiness. All right, let's look into this buttery sweet one. Oh yeah, this one was butter and sugar, powdered sugar. Wow, look at all that flakiness there on the inside. Gosh, lots of layers. I really feel like this is like a French pastry. Another incredible crust. My 3-ingredient, simple, gluten-free and vegan pie crust recipe for both savory and sweet fillings includes Teff flour, which I think makes a fantastic pie crust. It's a must-try flour for anyone. Coconut oil, that's the key in this recipe. Salt, and of course, water. When I discovered a gluten intolerance, I learned quite a bit about gluten-free flours and their health benefits. With trial and error in finding a good gluten-free pie crust that had great flavor, the only pie crust I have found that I really like and actually sort of crave is one that's made with Teff flour and coconut oil. Those 2 ingredients are key to making an incredibly tasty pie crust for either savory or sweets. Now, Teff flour can be either light or dark brown in color. As you can see here, I have some in a bowl. It looks like chocolate milk powder when it's unbaked, and it looks like cocoa when it's baked. It gets really dark. However, it is not sweet at all. It's a very fine powder, but there's no gluten in it, so it's not going to have that gluten stretch and have the structure that we typically have with a regular flour. Teff is the well-known Ethiopian flour used to make the famous spongy injera bread. This flour can be used to make quick breads, cookies, brownies, pancakes, muffins, and much more. The health benefits are pretty incredible too. See my recipe link below for more info on Teff flour. So for our purposes today, let's get into the recipe. It's super quick and comes together fast. There's no refrigeration or waiting either. It's done, baked, and you can eat it pretty quickly. Okay, to get started, go ahead and put ice in a measuring cup and add about a cup of water. We're gonna need more water for this recipe than a traditional recipe using regular flour. So get that water cold and set it aside. For this recipe, you can totally use a food processor, but my hands work for me. So in a large bowl, we're gonna add 1.5 cups of Teff flour. We're gonna add 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and I don't think that's too much in this recipe because it adds a lot of flavor to the Teff and the coconut oil. So the next ingredient we add is 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. Okay, and as with a typical pie crust, since we're using a solid coconut oil, which is my preference, I just cut in that fat. Take a look at it. Again, looks like coarse cornmeal. Boy, this sure does look like cocoa, doesn't it? But it's not, I promise. It has no resemblance to cocoa whatsoever. In fact, Teff flour has a very mild, earthy flavor to it. That mixed with a little sweetness of the coconut oil, I'm telling you, it's an incredible pie. I was shocked when I first made this and realized how good it was. And I've made many quiches using this pie crust. Okay, so we're gonna put equal amount of water as we did with fat. So we're gonna put 1/4 cup here. And again, I'm gonna strain mine. Make sure I don't get any ice cubes in it. 2 tablespoons. Just gonna pour it in here all together and then just stir it up. This is gonna be a little grainier than a typical pie crust. As long as it sticks together, that's all you need to worry about. And it is gonna look dry, and it will be a little bit dry, probably drier than a typical pie crust, but don't be alarmed. It should look that way, and it will turn out. I've had a lot of luck with this pie crust. Even though it's grainy, notice it comes together. So now you just need a pie plate. Mine is a 9.5-inch pie plate. You can use anywhere from an 8 to 10. And then just place your mixture in the pie plate. We're just gonna press it down. Try to get an equal thickness all around. This flour, again, does not have any gluten, so you don't have the structure like you would a regular flour pie crust, but it's the water and the coconut oil that holds this flour together. I intentionally left some of the mixture in the bowl because now I'm going to use it to form the top edge. So just place it where you want it, and because it sticks, it won't fall off. It'll actually stick. It's resilient in that you can shape it in any way that you want, and you're going to be pretty safe. And if it falls off, no big deal. Just add more to it and you won't be able to tell. Now, before I add any more, I'm going to stop for a minute. I like to take a flat bottom bowl and then put it in the pie crust and press down. And I do it all the way around, including the sides. I'll go along the bottom and then along the edge and press against the edge. This is not meant to be a flaky pie crust. In fact, it's going to be a bit of a crumbly one, but it will still cut like a regular pie crust. The pie crust just needs to be decorated just a little bit. You could leave it like this if you wanted to. I'm just going to go around, do my little crimped edges here, and there you are. It's our gluten-free, sweet or savory, vegan pie crust. If you feel it needs to be blind baked at 350 for 5 minutes, then remove the crust from the oven and let it cool slightly about 10 minutes, then add the filling. Pretty much follow your recipe's directions. To completely pre-bake the crust for cold fillings, all you have to do is take a fork, just prick the bottom of the pie crust all the way around. Then we just put it in the oven at 350 degrees for about 15 minutes, and then it's ready. Pie crust just came out of the oven. Notice it looks a little drier than it did before, and it's definitely a little darker. So it does look like a cocoa pie crust, but it's not. We're gonna let it cool, and then of course when you cut into it, it's gonna cut just like a pie crust. Okay, so this one has cooled. So let's take a slice out of this and let's just see what we have. There's no gluten in here, so you don't have that stretch. So it is going to crumble a bit. This is the way this pie crust should look. But notice you can cut into it like a regular pie crust and take your pie out of it. So that leaves us with 3 generations of beautiful looking and tasting pie crust. We have my grandma's 3-ingredient shortening, flour, and salt pie crust. We have my mom's sweet pie crust with powdered sugar is the unique ingredient in this, and it is incredibly flaky with the butter. And then on to my gluten-free and vegan pie crust that is quite tasty. And this, of course, is just Teff flour, coconut oil, salt, and a little bit of water. That's it. Super simple, very basic. Try any of these, you won't be disappointed. There you have it. 3 generations of simple and basic pie crust fit for a variety of diets, for the holidays, or anytime you get a hankering for pie. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your continued support. And until next time, go bake the world.